Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin as it has now swept the range low and it's bounced off of that range low. So, we want to talk about the implications of that. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Bitcoin has in fact swept the range low that it set here back in late November. So it essentially corresponded to around 90K. And one of the things we've mentioned for the last couple of months is that we would likely see Bitcoin sweep that range low, regardless of whether it ultimately continues higher or if it breaks down. And the reason for that is, well, we've seen Bitcoin do that very thing this entire market cycle. This entire market cycle, Bitcoin has been all about setting a low, going up, not having enough demand at those higher levels to justify it going even higher. It then has to go back down, sweep a prior low, and then it tries again. Okay. And we've seen this happen many, many times. Okay. So if you just look within the last couple of years, even last year, right? Even last year, you'll see what I'm talking about. How there was this low set right there. Bitcoin bounced around it for a while. Eventually, it swept the low and then bounced up for a while. I mean, this low here was in May, and then Bitcoin trended higher generally until June, right? I mean, this was for about a month or so. It was just going up. Now, it didn't set a new all-time high, but it was essentially a decent move back up to the upside. Now, of course, it had an initial move up, and then it actually got a pullback back down where it was able to put in a higher low and then build off of that. But again, this same thing has happened so many times. Even over here, you could argue that it set a low and then it went up, did not have enough strength to get through to a new all-time high, back down, swept the prior low before it got another bounce. This pattern we also saw exactly 1 year ago. All right. Now, exactly 1 year ago in January. Sorry, we had a rally the same time, right? October to November rally. Bitcoin then had a nice move up here in early January, and then it ultimately swept the range low. Now, back over here, the low was around 40K, and when it swept it, it went all the way down to about 38K, 38 and a half. Okay, so it did go just below it. Following that sweep of the prior low, Bitcoin then rallied from that low, right? It rallied up about 13.5%. It then got a pullback, about a 3 to 4% pullback. And then it went up and put in a new all-time high. So that's essentially what happened back then, right? 13% up from that range low. If we go look at what Bitcoin has accomplished since this range low was set, it's now up about 8.5%. For reference, a 13% move would actually put it right back around where it was over here when it went just north of $100,000. Now, there are other cases where we also swept the range low and it did not end up being as bullish. But in that case, you could also argue that the bounce off of the range low wasn't as intense, right? The momentum wasn't there in the same way. You could make the argument that there's periods back in 2023 when Bitcoin would set a low and then eventually sweep it, bounce, but it didn't really lead to anything, that was durable, right? It basically just rallied up to a lower high that had been set already, right? You see that how it had just went up to a lower high after sweeping the range low. Same thing, of course, happened in 2024 for a little while, right? There were times where after sweeping a range low, it would then just in fact rally to a lower high, and that was it. Okay. Now, if you look at the current one, right? If you look at the current one and we try to figure out, well, what would a lower high look like, right? If it does end up being a lower high and it doesn't break out, what would that look like? You could argue that it's that structure right there. Okay. So a lower high, depending on when it happens, and again, a lower high doesn't necessarily mean it has to eventually break down. It might just have to consolidate for a little while longer. But you can see that if it were to go back up here, by, say, around the election, it would put it right around 100K, right around 100K. We also have talked about, the ability, the possibility that Bitcoin could eventually, sort of check back in with these higher highs right there. That's essentially, what we saw happen back over here last year, right? Going 2023 and then into 2024, then Bitcoin eventually tagged that trend line all the way out in March of that year. So I would also kind of remember that if it were to happen, it could correspond to, closer to 130 or 140, depending on when it happens. Like if it happens on the same time frame it did last year, that's what it would correspond to. But I think the biggest question in the short term is, what happens as this lower high comes into play? Is Bitcoin able to take it out or is it not? You can see back over here in 2024, it never really set much of an obvious lower high structure, right? There was this high right here, but it wasn't really putting in that same type of thing. You could try to argue maybe it was a sort of a bounce back up to it, rejection, it breaks through, back test it, and then go. But that's a little hand wavy, a little wishy washy. I wouldn't put a lot of faith into something like that. What I would say is this. If you look back at this range here, there was also sort of a range low that was set really early on. And Bitcoin, after sweeping it, went back up near the highs, but it never could really break through, right? It could never really break through. And eventually, it basically gave up and went below the range low. And then after spending some time below the range low with no ability to get back above it, Bitcoin broke down and it essentially gave back all of its gains, right? Most of them, right? From this low there, right? So if you look at that low there, Bitcoin went up and then eventually it gave back all of those gains, had to consolidate at some lower levels for longer before it had enough juice to really go to new all-time highs. You see that? So the only reason, I'm sort of looking at these different scenarios is because you can find reasons to believe that all of them are somewhat relevant. And the reality is none of them are going to provide a perfect analog for the current price action, but they give you an idea of what we've experienced this market cycle so as to be aware of some of the general milestones for Bitcoin to get through here in the next couple of weeks. From a seasonality perspective, this is the most compelling argument, right? Just looking at, say, January, right? This is exactly what happened last January. Bitcoin had a rally and then eventually sold off, found a low where it swept the prior low, got a nice bounce, consolidated, and then went up in February, right? And from a market cycle seasonality perspective, we've seen corrections by Bitcoin in January that then tend to bottom out by the end of January. Okay. And we've actually seen a number of those. This one in 2017 actually bottomed out a lot earlier, right? It didn't take until the end of January. It actually bottomed out January 12th. Okay. So if you look at the current low by Bitcoin that we just had, that occurred January 13th, I believe. Yeah, January 13th. So not that dissimilar, honestly, from what we saw in 2017. I mean, this is pretty similar to what we saw in 2017. I think the main difference between the low that was set in 2017 and the low that was just set is that in 2017 it was a larger drop. It also corresponded to testing a prior local high from June of the prior year, right? So to give you an idea of what that would look like, right? June of the prior year, June of 2016, Bitcoin was all the way up here, right? And it hasn't tested that. Now, again, the question is it going to? That would obviously not be the most fun outcome if it were to do that. But you can see that is what happened in 2017, at least, right? The from a time-based perspective, the correction ended on January 12th, and then it was essentially just up only until March before it got another pullback. But the counterpoint is that it was a deeper correction, and it also corresponded to testing a local high from the prior year. And again, last cycle, the correction did not end really until the end of January, and that's when we started moving once again. So I guess that sort of raises that, and this is an idea we've talked about, and I don't really think it needs to be your base case, but there are examples this cycle where Bitcoin goes up and then goes sideways and then just gives those gains back, consolidates, and then goes up. This occurred at a different time of the year, right? This drop here occurred during Q3, which is usually a pretty weak time in the markets, right? You have August, September, those generally are the worst months for Bitcoin. And so that's what you got over there. You also had a similar drop last year around that time where it basically just gave back all of the gains that it had. And so trying to figure out, is there a chance that Bitcoin repeats what happened in 2023 at this point in the year? Or does it have to happen later on in the year, maybe in Q3 or something? Because if it happens to happen now and it comes back down here, this is basically giving back all the post-election gains, right? All the post-election gains would be gone if Bitcoin tested the prior high from June of last year, right? If it had to go back down there and test that like it did in 2017, all those post-election gains would be gone. But I guess the counterpoint is, of course, well, the S&P gave back all of its gains, following the election results, and the Russell gave back all of its gains following the election results. So does Bitcoin have to do the same? I'd like to believe that it doesn't. But if that does play out, just know that it's actually a very common pattern that we've seen. The only way I really see something like that playing out is, I guess there's a couple ways, but the primary way, the more obvious way, would be that if like the 10-year yield just keeps going higher. If the 10-year yield doesn't take a breather and it just keeps going up here, and if the 30-year yield gets and stays above 5%, then it would make me more inclined to believe that something like that could happen, because if the 30-year yield stays up at these levels, well, we can see what happened last time the 30-year yield was up at these levels. We can see that the S&P was in fact selling off, okay? And if the S&P drops, good chance that Bitcoin would drop too. What I would argue in the short term is exactly what I told you guys yesterday, right? No one knows. The market could go up or down, thanks for the insight, Ben. But the point here is that in this case, you have a range low, right? And the range low is 90K. As long as Bitcoin is above 90K, then it does not yet favor this outcome, right? Where it gives back those gains, okay? As long as we're above 90K, it does not favor this outcome, and instead favors slightly more this outcome where it just sweeps the low and then goes. What you would look for to have any evidence that this would become the more likely outcome as opposed to this, watch the 10-year yield. If it keeps going up, it's going to be a headwind for Bitcoin, okay? But what you would look for is if Bitcoin spends some time below the range low, right? So in this case, what happened was Bitcoin went all the way up, it came back down, but eventually, it really dropped below 30K and stayed below 30K for a number of weeks. And because of that, the market got weaker and weaker and weaker until it sold off and found demand down here, okay? So if Bitcoin has to follow that blueprint, which is not even at the same time of the year when you would normally see something like that, but if it does, because the 10-year yield just say does not relent, then you would likely see Bitcoin spend some time around 88K, 89K for a while before going back and testing maybe 70K, right? And then trying to find support there. But again, as long as we're above 90, that is not, the primary concern. If you go below 90, right? Like if it does something like this where it, drops here and then just fades like that for a little while, then it would more so favor that idea. In the short term, I think what you have to look for is the lower high structure. And that lower high structure is going to come in around 100K. So I think 100K is going to be kind of the line in the sand. If you look at this chart, you'll notice that it sort of started right here, second tag, a third tag would theoretically be right around $100,000. If that happens and Bitcoin gets rejected again and it comes back down here and gets below 90K, then this outcome is more likely, where it just follows what the S&P did and the Russell did and give back those post-election gains in the short term. It doesn't mean that it couldn't get it back, but that's the more likely outcome if that were to happen. But as long as we're above 90K and as long as it can take out 100K, then it would more so favor the other outcomes that we've seen. So those are my general thoughts right now. And you know, this really goes to show you the power of sweeping a low. And we talked about this for months. I know a lot of people had a hard time believing this, especially when it was back at 108K and over here at 99K, and even a couple of weeks ago or a week or so ago at 102. But it goes to show you the importance of just reminding yourself that Bitcoin does go through this pattern of setting a low and then eventually sweeping it. And as long as you're patient, it does tend to work out like that. And you can see that once again, the exact same thing has happened. And hopefully some of you guys were able to get in there, and now you're up a lot in a relatively short period of time. So just wanted to follow up there. Bitcoin did in fact sweep the range low. We'll follow up with what comes next. 100K is going to be the main resistance level, I think, at this point. We'll see if Bitcoin can break through it. If not, look for 90K to see if it holds support. If it's below 90K for a week or so, then I think it would favor more so what happened over here. And the only reason I keep bringing that up is because that was basically the last time that the 10-year yield was doing something like what it's doing right now. It was back over there. So from a seasonality standpoint, it doesn't really make sense to compare to this. But from the 10-year yield is going absolutely crazy standpoint, that's why there's some relevance to at least look at that. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there, guys. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I do appreciate you guys tuning in. Again, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Bye.